But why would the state be invested in defining what a good Christian is? Isn't it surprising, especially in a secular state like the US, or in my case, the Muslim ruled state like the Ottoman Empire?
Welcome to Preaching to the Comments, a podcast where Princeton scholars answer the internet's burning questions. When we looked online, we found several people asking who gets to decide what is and isn't true in Christianity. So today we'll be looking at what makes a good Christian. Why would the state be invested in defining what a good Christian is? Who polices Christianity? Is Christianity defined from the ground up or from the top down? So these and other questions we'll be exploring today. Buckle up.
Hello, my name is Kamila Klitukhina. I'm a PhD candidate in the History Department, and I study Ottoman Empire and Orthodox Christians in the Eastern Europe.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Stitz. I'm a Princeton PhD candidate in the History Department, and I studied the Christianization of the late Roman Empire.
Hi, I'm Jenny Wiley Legath, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center. I also teach in the Religion Department. My field of study is American religion from the 19th century to the present, with attention to women's history and gender.
So what makes a good Christian? For me in my research, at least in the Roman Empire, being a good Christian meant siding with the emperor's church. So upholding state creeds, denouncing heretics, and supporting the exile of those who resisted church conformity. So after the famous Council of Nicaea in the year 325, for instance, the faithful, so those who agreed with the creed, were expected to condemn the priests who did not agree. So those priests like Arius and his followers.
That sounds fascinating because in the Ottoman Empire, being a good Christian often entailed paying taxes to the Muslim state authorities on time, not carrying any weapons, and making sure not to ride a horse unless absolutely necessary for safety reasons.
Well, in the mid-20th century United States, being a good Christian meant saying the Pledge of Allegiance, saluting the flag, and opposing communism at home and abroad.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is tramping out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
So who gets to decide what is and isn't true in Christianity? Some people might assume that this answer is what you find in the scriptures, in the New Testament. But in our historical studies, we've discovered multiple actors continuously seeking to define and redefine Christianity, and the state is one of those actors. And the state means different things in our different times and places. So in the US, when we talk about state power, we are talking about the federal government, but that power is also exercised at the state and local levels through laws and institutions such as courts, schools, and prisons.
And when we talk about the state in the case of the Roman and Ottoman empires, we refer primarily to the ruler, that is, the emperor or the sultan, and his various agents, such as imperial bureaucrats, judges, and the military apparatus.
But why would the state be invested in defining what a good Christian is? Isn't it surprising, especially in a secular state like the US, or in my case, the Muslim ruled state like the Ottoman Empire?
I think the answer is in the interplay between being a good citizen and a good Christian, even though the contexts differ wildly.
Yeah, so my context in the late Roman Empire, defining what a good Christian was became inseparable from defining what a good, loyal Roman citizen was. After Constantine's conversion around the year 312, emperors quickly realized that Christianity structures, its bishops, its councils, its creeds, its church hierarchy, could serve the same function that imperial cults once did. It did this through reinforcing obedience and unity. So religion was a means of state consolidating power, not just a matter of faith or a matter of practice. So when Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325, it wasn't just out of pure theological curiosity, right? It wasn't just talking about Bible stuff with his homies. But he was trying to bring order to an empire that was fractured by deep theological schisms. So orthodoxy in a way became a form of allegiance, publicly aligning oneself with the emperor's chosen creed. It meant loyalty to his rule. So this is why heresy was not treated as mere error, but was indeed treacherous and even seditious.
So it sounds like to Constantine, theology was part of governing.
Yes, it was. They became intertwined.
That's fascinating because in the Ottoman case, it would be difficult to say that Orthodox Christianity was intertwined with the state. But nevertheless, a lot of things that you've mentioned, such as the concept of order and the importance of Christians acting in Christian-like ways, was directly related to the idea of the well-being of society in general and of the Ottoman Empire in particular. And in the Ottoman case, I think idea of order was based on presupposition that all elements of society would be acting in the way they're expected to do according to law. And for Christians, that entailed following certain rules, some of which I've mentioned before, such as being discernibly Christian, wearing certain clothing, not mixing with the Muslims, carrying or not carrying weapons, riding horses or donkeys, even not building their churches taller than the mosques. And just like you mentioned in the case of the Roman Empire, being a good Christian and acting as one was tantamount to being a good, loyal, obedient Ottoman subject.
So it sounds like in the Ottoman Empire, being a good Christian meant fitting into your role in a religiously diverse empire.
Absolutely. But in the US, we're not talking about imperial subjects. We are talking about free citizens. Are there any parallels in the case of the US?
Americans would like to think that the United States is a completely different case because we have these principles enshrined in the founding document. We have the 2 religion clauses in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the free exercise clause saying that the government will not interfere with the free exercise of religion, and the establishment clause saying that the government will not establish any kind of religion. So Americans would like to think that the government is completely religiously neutral. However, in practice, U.S. Americans have used religion, and specifically Christianity, as a proxy measure of things they would like to see in good citizens, such as morality, respectability, probity.
So this type of Christian morality is not legislated at all, right? It doesn't come from Congress, but it comes from bottom up. It comes from other Christian citizens policing each other. At least in my context, it was kind of the opposite. So within ancient Rome, these things were legislated through the emperor. You have the famous edict of Thessalonica in year 380, which declared this one version of Christianity called Nicene Christianity to be the only legitimate faith of the whole empire. It instantly turned theology into state law, right? So heretics, those who basically did not conform to this, could lose their churches, their property, or their right to even assemble.
This makes me wonder, what tools does the state really have to define Christianity or ensure that it's practiced the way the state envisions? So law is clearly one of those tools, but that's not always the case, I assume.
No, it's not always the case. And so even through architecture, this was very subtle, right? This is a bit of Roman, I guess, theological soft power. right? So grand basilicas like St. John Lateran in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and imperial complexes that adjoin certain cathedrals and basilicas became visual symbols of the state's approved faith. Right? So to worship in these spaces was to affirm the emperor's Christianity, and to be barred from them was to be marked as a deviant.
That's so interesting because in the United States, what we see is religious iconography creeping into supposedly secular government buildings, such as, for example, the central location given to the figure of Moses within the U.S. Capitol building, where the Speaker of the House standing and looking out into the room sees the image of Moses right in front of them. Thus, in its own subtle way, United States government buildings can inculcate this Judeo-Christian heritage.
Well, that's fascinating because I think in the Ottoman case, it seems that architecture did not play such a stark role in defining Christianity and enforcing orthopraxy. I think a lot of definitions of Christianity came through written text in different forms. So one of the most interesting examples is patriarchal decrees of appointment that were issued by the Ottoman Central Administration. And within that decree of appointment, the state would also define what things are related to the Orthodox rite and what are not related, what are outside of the patriarchal responsibility. And patriarch was supposed to be the one who polices or appoints people who would police that all the matters related to Christianity are executed in the way they were supposed to execute. So this could be related to marriages. This could be related to collecting taxes or not collecting taxes from a certain people, collecting them in a certain way, having the ability to move around the empire. And we see over time, the more stipulations are added, and they essentially reflect the political and social reality of the Ottoman Empire at the time. So what was okay for Christians to do in the 16th century, suddenly in the 18th century becomes problematic. Like there is this clause about Orthodox monk venturing outside of the confines of their monasteries to collect alms, which was a practice everywhere, I guess, where Christianity existed. And there are no stipulations related to this practice early on. But in the 18th century, it apparently becomes a problem because we see how state starts to include the stipulations slowly in the patriarchal decree of appointment, first saying that Orthodox monks should not leave the confines of their monasteries. And the next patriarchal decree of appointment several years later says that Orthodox monks should not leave the confines of their monasteries and walk around asking for things. And several years later, this stipulation develops and claims that it is in fact against the Orthodox rite for monks to walk around asking for money. So in this way, we see how the state was actively, proactively, I would say, formulating what is and what isn't supposed to be done by Orthodox Christians as a reflection of developments that were happening at the time.
And so regarding these patriarchs and these other bishops, did they always support what the state enforced regarding Christian practices? For instance, in the late 4th century, there was this firebrand named Athanasius, and he was exiled multiple times by different emperors because he disagreed with what they were saying regarding Christian practices and how bishops should conduct themselves. Emperor Theodosius, the one who basically mandated everyone should be Nicene Christian, he was really sore one day when one of his cities, Thessalonica, started to riot. And so he had most of the citizens killed, right, on site. Just a huge massacre. As one bishop, Emilian Ambrose, bars him from taking communion. The emperor had to basically ask Ambrose for forgiveness to receive the Christian rites again. So this is one of those watershed moments for church authority over imperial authority.
So, Jeremy, it sounds like state power over Christianity was never a one-way street.
Right.
It was always a contestation.
It was tenuous at times, yeah.
This is a great example of persistent negotiation between the state and religious actors, as both parties seek to define and instrumentalize Christianity as they see fit. This pattern is prevalent in the Ottoman case as well, even though Orthodox Christian clergy could not resort to excommunication against the Muslim emperor for obvious reasons. But what they could do is stop paying their taxes, which was definitely a tool of influence and got their message across. So what would happen when the Orthodox Christians did not feel that the Ottoman ruler was doing his part of the bargain, which was essentially protecting his population? Orthodox Christians would start petitioning the central administration, claiming that they are loyal subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They've been paying taxes as they're supposed to, but unless the ruler interferes and completes his part of the agreement, that is ensuring safety in the region and security, they would unfortunately have to cease paying taxes because they would not be able to collect taxes in such unsafe and insecure environment. And then sometimes the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, especially those living on borders with other empires, for example, with the Habsburg Empire, they would just abandon their Ottoman homelands and move to neighboring empires that often happened during wars.
That's so interesting about taxes, Camilla, because taxes and war are places where Americans in the United States have also registered what they see as Christian dissent from government policy. From the 18th century days, the Quakers, the Society of Friends, also later the Mennonites have refused to fight in wars on behalf of the United States government. And in more recent times, also some of these traditional peace churches, as they're known, and their members have refused to pay taxes that support war because they believe that it interferes with their interpretation of Christianity. So is the state always interested in interfering or participating strongly in defining a good Christian?
In my case, it seems that state becomes particularly involved in the definition of, or in defining what Christianity is and how a Christian is supposed to act in times of maybe crisis or in periods where status quo becomes defunct. For instance, in the Ottoman case, there is this example of the interactions between Catholics and Orthodox. So in certain regions, especially along Mediterranean, Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians lived alongside each other for centuries. And some sources say that they were fairly intertwined. Sometimes they would baptize each other's children, attend each other's churches, intermarry. And that didn't seem to be a problem for the Ottoman state up until 18th century, when the power of both France and the Habsburg empires, both Catholic states, became more pronounced in the region. And at that point, it became extremely important for the Ottoman state to be able to discern who is Orthodox and who is Catholic, because the Catholicism came with the subtle suspicion of being a traitor when it came to imperial subjecthood.
So what happens when the state and Christians disagree in their definition of a good Christian?
There's one not widely known case study of this cleric named Priscillian from this small town in Spain called Avila. Now, he was what the Nicene Christians would deem a heretic, and he was brought before one of the emperors named Maximus. And as a show of force, Maximus actually had this person executed. This was a big no-no within the imperial state. Emperors did wield absolute power, but concerning heretical figures, their preferred method of punishment was exile. They never killed an ecclesiastic. And so we see here that the state will wield the sword to enforce its certain view of orthodoxy. In another violent case, we have Hypatia, a famous female pagan philosopher who was lynched by a Christian mob within Alexandria amid these factional disputes and struggles. between church and state. So these cases showed how blurred those boundaries had become. Even when emperors and bishops nominally agreed, power struggles over who defined true Christianity could spill into bloodshed.
In a case other than withholding taxes, sometimes the Orthodox Christians chose to abandon Ottoman Empire completely, and often they were motivated by the idea that it was not acceptable for Orthodox Christians to be living under the Muslim rule in general. Right? Some Christians, for example, Serbs, also chose to migrate to the Habsburg Empire first to live under a Catholic monarch, but then they believed that they faced a certain degree of persecution there and pressure from the Catholics, and they chose to were striving to migrate to the Russian Empire to live under the one Orthodox Tsar. And it is fascinating that they spent a lot of time writing petitions and monographs claiming that the Greeks, another Orthodox group who were occupying extremely powerful position within the Ottoman state, were not true Christians because they collaborated with the Muslim authorities to the extent that they managed to gain this very powerful position within the Ottoman state. So migration was often the answer, but not all everyone had the opportunity to do so. It was mostly populations who lived at the borders of other empires and had the ability to easily cross.
You both mention migration as a response to state pressure on Christians. And I can think of an example in 19th century US history where a Christian group took to migration, specifically the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This group, also known as the Mormons, left New York in the 1830s and moved west, eventually to the Utah Territory, because they were being persecuted by the people around them for what were seen as heterodox beliefs. In later decades, the political power of the U.S. takes an interest, less to police Mormon beliefs, but more because of the practices, namely the practice of polygamy. So when people in the Utah Territory want to become a state within the United States, the federal government says, nope, not till the Mormon Church disavows the practice of polygamy, because that practice marked a place where state and church goals conflicted. Throughout U.S. history, we see this with Christian groups that are outside the mainstream of Protestant or Catholic Christianity. The state definitely takes an interest when Mormons practice polygamy, when the Native American Church wants to use peyote, considered an illegal drug, as a sacrament, or when the Branch Davidians start stockpiling weapons, as examples. So in the United States, even in a country with no state-sponsored religion, government power is still intertwined with defining religion, even in subtle ways. The United States can promote the version of Christianity that it associates with good citizenship.
And what I found fascinating about our conversation is how it demonstrates that any religion, but Christianity in particular, is far from rigid, is far from being defined thousands of years ago. It's a lived practice that changes and adapts to the values and necessities of every day. If you think about it, we discussed Christianity in three very different temporal, geographical, and political contexts. In late antique Rome, Christianity reigned as an official state religion. In the early modern Ottoman Empire, Christianity was one of the tolerated non-Muslim religions in a Muslim-ruled state. And in the contemporary United States, Christianity maintains its dominance in an officially secular state. In all of these contexts, across time and space, Christianity and actors seeking to define it demonstrated both remarkable resilience and adaptability.
And I think this flexibility within Christianity itself helped it to survive as long as it has in its many forms since its inception. I mean, even if you look at the New Testament, there's already the division and tension between the followers of Christ. There were already debates about rules and practices and which commandments to obey. Then when the state gets involved, these questions multiply. So these have been perennial issues within the Christian movement for the past 2,000 years, and they'll probably stay with us for many years to come.
So what makes a good Christian? Sounds like it depends on who you ask and when and where.
Yeah, sorry, folks. We'll leave it with the dreaded answer, it all depends.
Preaching to the Commons is produced by the media team at the Center for Culture, Society, and Religion at Princeton University. For transcripts and more information, please visit our website at ccsr.princeton.edu.